After the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon's name echoed throughout Europe. The crushing defeat of Austria and Russia frightened the other monarchies in Europe. Everyone now knew that Napoleon was on his way to becoming the master not only of France but of the whole of Europe. This great victory strengthened Napoleon's hand and paved the way for his plans to further expand France's imperial borders. Under Napoleon's leadership, France had become the most powerful state in Europe. But Napoleon's victories were not only military. With every battle he won, he redrew the political map of Europe. His victory at Austerlitz not only gave him territory, but also caused Austria and Russia to lose power diplomatically. With this great victory, Napoleon took action to establish a new order in Europe. The Treaty of Pressburg signed with Austria gave Napoleon full control over Italy. As France's borders expanded, one by one the monarchies in Europe began to submit to Napoleon's power. The consequences of the Battle of Austerlitz were not limited to the battlefield of that day. This victory was one of Napoleon's most important steps towards becoming the sole ruler of Europe. As France became the greatest power in Europe, Napoleon became an emperor who imposed himself on the entire continent. After this victory, the kingdoms of Europe were helpless against Napoleon's huge armies. Napoleon was growing France not only through military victories, but also through diplomacy and reforms. Napoleon's dominance over Europe was now an unquestionable reality. In the grand storms of history, Napoleon Bonaparte's career, filled with victories, also included some defeats. One such defeat occurred in his relentless struggle against England, the dominant naval power of the time. The Battle of Trafalgar was a turning point that exposed a weakness in Napoleon's military genius while shaking the political and economic foundations of Europe. Napoleon's rise in Europe was shaped by his successes on land. However, England had established complete dominance at sea, and France was unable to fully showcase the superiority of its army against this powerful island nation. Napoleon knew that the only way to defeat England was to weaken it economically. But taking England through a direct invasion was impossible without overcoming its naval power. In 1805, while land wars in Europe were going well for Napoleon, a different story was unfolding at sea. At this time, England's greatest defense was its navy. The French navy had been strengthened in line with Napoleon's expansion plans, but the British dominance at sea prevented France from fully exploiting this advantage. The Spanish navy, allied with the French, could have played a crucial role in Napoleon's dream of invading England. However, this naval battle would become one of Napoleon's greatest defeats. The Battle of Trafalgar took place right in the middle of Napoleon's plans to subdue England. On October 21, 1805, off the coast of Cape Trafalgar in southern Spain, two of Europe's great naval powers faced each other. England's legendary Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson had prepared an extremely strategic plan against Napoleon's combined French and Spanish fleet. Lord Nelson was known for his superior tactical skills in naval battles and his bold leadership. The French and Spanish allied fleet, inspired by Napoleon's land victories, entered the battle with confidence. However, things did not go Napoleon's way at sea. Lord Nelson's bold and aggressive strategy turned the French and Spanish navies upside down. Nelson went beyond traditional naval tactics, using a technique of slicing between enemy ships to divide and bewilder them. This tactic left the enemies vulnerable by separating them from each other. The battle at Trafalgar was like a chess game on the seas. Napoleon's navy was devastated by the superior maneuvers of the British. French admirals fought with great determination to execute Napoleon's plans, but the balance of power at sea was in England's favor. During this grand battle, even though Lord Nelson lost his life under enemy fire on his flagship, HMS Victory, he won the battle and once again secured England's naval superiority. The victory at Trafalgar did not just stay confined to that day, it ensured England's naval dominance for centuries and dashed Napoleon's plans to invade England. Napoleon, heavily defeated at Trafalgar, lost much of his faith in naval power and was forced to completely change his strategy. Unable to defeat England at sea, Napoleon decided to focus on economically crippling it. After Trafalgar, Napoleon's new weapon against England was the Continental Blockade. This was a massive trade embargo system aimed at choking England economically. Napoleon sought to isolate England by banning all European states from trading with it, hoping to cripple its economy and force it to submit to him. This economic warfare became a major struggle that spread to every corner of Europe. The main goal of the Continental Blockade was to weaken England by cutting off its foreign trade and thus force it to surrender to Napoleon. However, the Continental Blockade did not go as Napoleon had hoped. Initially, some European countries appeared to submit to Napoleon's plan. France's power was recognized, especially in regions like Germany and Italy. But England's extensive trade network across Europe continually found new ways to bypass the blockade. British traders found ways to trade despite Napoleon's restrictions, and illegal trade and smuggling breached the blockade. Major countries like Russia could not ignore the profits from trading with England and did not fully comply with the embargo. The failure of the blockade not only thwarted Napoleon's plans to cripple England, but also caused significant damage to the European economy. Many European countries paid a heavy economic price for losing trade with England. Poverty and halted trade began to erode public confidence in Napoleon across the continent. Countries that were developing in industry and agriculture particularly suffered from the lack of access to goods imported from England. Although Napoleon tried to manage the effects of this economic war, growing unrest across Europe began to jeopardize his empire. The failure of the Continental Blockade was not just an economic blow for Napoleon, it also represented a loss of political prestige. Many states in Europe began to revolt against Napoleon's harsh economic policies. The ineffectiveness of the blockade became a sign of Napoleon's weakening power. Particularly, Russia's continued trade with England and breaching of the blockade irritated Napoleon. This foreshadowed a major conflict between France and Russia in the future. One of the reasons for Napoleon's Russian campaign was the failure of the Continental Blockade. In conclusion, the Battle of Trafalgar is remembered as Napoleon's great naval defeat. This defeat forced Napoleon to abandon his plans to invade England and redirected him towards attempting to weaken England through economic embargoes. However, this economic war also failed, starting to undermine Napoleon's hegemony in Europe. The disrupted economic balance in Europe weakened public support for Napoleon and laid the groundwork for his future, greater defeats. My dear listeners, as I recount how Napoleon was dragged into one of history's turning points, and how the days of glorious victories were left behind, I almost feel like I'm reliving those moments. While Napoleon's brilliant victories echoed through the heart of Europe, a completely different story was about to unfold on the Iberian Peninsula. Spain was about to bring a different kind of fight to Napoleon, not the grand battles he was used to, but a resistance written in blood in the shadows, narrow streets, mountain passes, and every street corner guerrilla warfare. In 1808, as Napoleon's ambition for Europe turned towards Spain, he aimed to gain full control over Spain, which was already an ally of France. France's intervention in Spain was initially strategic and carefully planned. Napoleon wanted to establish direct control over the kingdom by placing his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. However, this move was seen as a significant injustice and an insulting occupation by the Spanish people. The Spaniards would never submit to having their own king forcibly removed and replaced with a representative of a foreign power, the French, and thus began Spain's great resistance against Napoleon. When French troops entered Spain, Napoleon couldn't fully anticipate how this rebellion would turn into a massive war. Napoleon relied on the classic methods of warfare. He was accustomed to large armies in battlefield engagements, crushing enemies with overwhelming force, capturing fortresses, and seizing cities. But the Spanish territories were about to show Napoleon a different kind of war, guerrilla warfare. While the Spanish people might not have had a regular army to fight the French directly, they were a population of fighters. This tactic, known as guerrilla warfare, meaning small war in Spanish, would inflict heavy losses on the French army. Spanish peasants, townspeople, mountain shepherds, and nearly all city dwellers took up arms to resist the French soldiers. This war was very different from the battlefronts Napoleon was used to. Spanish guerrillas employed tactics that made it impossible for the French to predict when or where they would strike. French soldiers were ambushed in Spain's narrow streets, steep slopes, and dark passages, unable to engage in regular warfare. The guerrillas would quickly vanish after their attacks, making it nearly impossible to track them down. Although the French had numerical superiority, dealing with this scattered and constantly shifting enemy proved extremely challenging. The French were increasingly losing soldiers and faced a major deadlock against the never-surrendering Spanish people. During this period, Napoleon lost the momentum he had gained in his victories across Europe. The Spanish territories were turning into a quagmire for him. Even when French soldiers managed to capture territories, it was never permanent. The Spanish people would fill the void left by French troops, and uprisings would flare up repeatedly. Every town and village turned into a battlefield against Napoleon. Moreover, it wasn't just a problem with Spain's terrain. The morale of the French soldiers was also declining. The prolonged conflict weakened the army and became a serious issue that Napoleon couldn't ignore. Napoleon's occupation of Spain also drew the attention of other European powers. England took action to exploit Napoleon's weak moment. The war on the Iberian Peninsula was becoming an international affair. England decided to support the resistance in Spain. British troops under the command of Duke Arthur Wellesley landed in Spain and began working with the Spanish guerrillas. Wellington, a commander well versed in Napoleon's strategies and highly successful against him, led the charge. Together with the Spanish guerrillas, they launched a comprehensive resistance against Napoleon's armies. With England's intervention, Napoleon's position in Spain was further shaken. French troops had to fight both the Spanish guerrillas and the regular British forces. Wellington's clever maneuvers began to wear down Napoleon's armies. The British, working alongside Spanish guerrillas, captured French strongholds one by one. The French army suffered heavy losses, and Napoleon needed to send more troops. However, with ongoing battles on other fronts in Europe, Napoleon couldn't adequately support his armies on both sides. In this process, Napoleon's occupation of Spain was drawn into a deadlock. Although Napoleon controlled a large portion of Spain, this control was never fully permanent. The Spanish people never ceased their resistance against the French. Guerrilla warfare continued to wear down the French army day by day. As Wellington's forces achieved victories against Napoleon, the belief in the possibility of resisting Napoleon spread across Europe. Napoleon not only failed to achieve success in Spain, but also began to weaken his empire. Strained both economically and militarily, Napoleon started to weaken in the face of other European powers. In conclusion, Napoleon's invasion of Spain would remain a deep wound in his otherwise brilliant career. The guerrilla warfare in Spain's narrow streets, mountains, and villages became one of the greatest factors in weakening the power of the French Empire. The unyielding resistance of the Spanish people, combined with Wellington's strategic maneuvers and England's military intervention, forced Napoleon to withdraw from Spain. This was a development that slowly began to erode Napoleon's dominance, not only in Spain but across Europe. Oh, what a great lesson these events contain. No matter how great Napoleon's power was, even empires can be shaken in the face of popular resistance. The war in Spain was one of Napoleon's greatest challenges, not just as a military leader, but also as a political leader. Ah, dear listeners, today we're witnessing one of the greatest disasters in history. As Napoleon looked out from his grand throne in France, he was determined to extend his power to the vast lands of Russia. But this time, despite the might of his empire, he hadn't fully reckoned with the ruthless force of nature and the unpredictability of war. Here's the story of Napoleon's infamous and tragic campaign into Russia with his enormous Grand Army. The year was 1812, and Napoleon was at the height of his power. He had either subdued or allied with most of Europe. However, one power threatened his dominance over the continent, Russia. Napoleon believed that subduing Russia would be the ultimate triumph of his empire. If he could conquer Russia, no force would be left to challenge him in Europe, and the world would be united under his rule. What ambition, what passion! Napoleon assembled one of the largest armies in history, the Grande Armée, or Great Army. This massive force consisted of nearly 500,000 soldiers. Troops from all over France, as well as allies, were on their way to join Napoleon's grand campaign. As the army advanced through Poland into Russian territory, Napoleon thought victory was just a few battles away. Like his previous triumphs, he expected to swiftly defeat the enemy, capture Moscow, and force the Russian Tsar to surrender. But Russia's vast and harsh landscape was about to present him with unforeseen resistance. The Russian commanders avoided direct confrontation with Napoleon, opting instead for a strategic withdrawal. As Napoleon advanced with his enormous army, he found it difficult to locate the enemy, seeing only continuous retreats from the Russians. However, this withdrawal wasn't a sign of surrender. The Russians were luring Napoleon into a trap. Burned villages, abandoned cities, devastated fields. The Russians were essentially laying waste to the lands through which Napoleon's army was marching. This was a strategy known in history as strategic withdrawal, drawing the enemy deeper, cutting off their supply lines and wearing them down. As Napoleon moved deeper into Russia, his army, unable to find food or shelter in the ravaged terrain, began to struggle with hunger and disease. Despite all this, Napoleon still pursued victory. And then came that unforgettable day, the Battle of Borodino. This battle would be one of the largest and bloodiest conflicts of Napoleon's Russian campaign. On September 7, 1812, in the town of Borodino near Moscow, Napoleon's forces clashed with the Russian army under General Kutuzov. On that day, with the sunrise, it was as if the gates of hell had opened. Cannons roared, cavalry charged, and infantry fought to the death. Both sides suffered tremendous losses. Napoleon technically won the battle, but it came at a very high cost. Borodino wasn't one of Napoleon's great victories, but rather a battle of attrition. The Russians had retreated, but Napoleon's army had also been severely weakened. And finally, Moscow. When Napoleon entered the Russian capital, Moscow, he was intoxicated by the sense of victory. This was the moment he thought he was a step closer to seeing himself as the conqueror of the world. But Moscow was empty. The Russians had evacuated their city, removed the population, and left almost no one behind. Moreover, Moscow was burning. The Russians had set the city on fire to prevent Napoleon from taking it. There was no food or shelter left. Napoleon began to realize that the victory he thought he had won was actually an illusion. Napoleon waited in Moscow. He hoped Tsar Alexander would surrender, but Alexander had clearly declared he would never negotiate with Napoleon. Napoleon had left his grand army to face hunger and cold in Moscow. And then came that cold winter. That unforgettable, ruthless Russian winter. When winter arrived, Napoleon's army was trapped in Moscow. The Russian winter was unlike anything else in the world. The cold was a deathly chill that reached to the bones. Napoleon's soldiers faced the dangers of starvation and freezing. Snowstorms, freezing temperatures, and icy winds seemed like nature's rebellion against Napoleon. The Grand Army dwindled day by day. Thousands of soldiers died from starvation or freezing. Realizing he couldn't stay in Moscow any longer, Napoleon decided to retreat. However, this retreat turned into a complete disaster. His army, depleted by hunger and disease, faced impassable snow-covered roads, and Russian guerrillas ambushed the retreating French at every turn. This retreat was like a death march for Napoleon's army. Entering Russia with 500,000 soldiers, Napoleon returned with only a few tens of thousands. The Grande Armée, that vast army, was almost entirely annihilated. Napoleon's Russian campaign became a turning point in his military career. This defeat marked the beginning of the end of Napoleon's power and empire. Russia's vast lands had become the one thing Napoleon couldn't conquer. This campaign signaled both his physical and moral exhaustion. Seen as invincible in Europe, Napoleon had been brought to his knees by the power of nature and human resistance in Russia, losing his grand army. Ah, what an unforgettable lesson, dear listeners. Even the greatest empires can be weakened by nature and the power of the people. Napoleon's Russian campaign is a striking example of how ambition and overconfidence can lead to the downfall of an emperor. Ah, dear listeners, welcome to the time when Napoleon's star was slowly fading and the great emperor's downfall began. His conquests had ravaged Europe and instilled fear in every country, but no power can stay at the top forever. And now the beginning of the end was approaching for Napoleon's vast empire. The great disaster of Napoleon's Russian campaign had sparked a glimmer of hope across the kingdoms of Europe. The Grand Army's exhaustion in the snow-covered lands of Russia had shattered the fear of Napoleon's military genius. Now European states that had once bowed to Napoleon's power or were reluctant allies were not about to miss this opportunity. It was time to face a weakened Napoleon and resist him. And so the great powers of Europe, forming what is historically known as the Sixth Coalition, came together against Napoleon. Who were in this alliance? Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and of course England, Napoleon's greatest adversary. These forces from different corners of Europe came together to restrain Napoleon or even to completely overthrow him. The formation of this alliance marked a turning point for Napoleon. He now had to face a united European army rather than easily defeating individual countries. Napoleon had fought many coalitions before and had always emerged victorious. But this time he faced a stronger and more determined enemy. And dear friends, the greatest blow from these united forces would come at the Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations, one of the bloodiest and largest battles in history. From October 16th to 19th, 1813, this battle in Leipzig would become a turning point in Napoleon's military career. Leipzig would be the scene of one of Europe's greatest conflicts up to that time. Around 600,000 soldiers faced off to determine Europe's fate. On one side was Napoleon and his army, and on the other, the combined forces of Europe. Every moment of the battle was a life and death struggle. Napoleon, confident in his military genius, believed he could win this battle too. However, the coalition army was very large, and they had learned from their past mistakes. The Prussians, Austrians, Russians, and other allies were prepared to counter Napoleon's famous tactics. Leipzig was not just a battle, it marked the moment when Napoleon began losing his dominance over Europe. In this three-day bloody conflict, both sides suffered significant losses. Cannons roared, cavalry clashed, and infantry fought to the death. The rivers around the city seemed to fill with blood from the intensity of the battle. But for Napoleon, Leipzig ended in disaster. The coalition forces cornered him. He was forced to retreat, but this retreat came with heavy losses. His army was weakened, and morale was shattered. Leipzig was Napoleon's first major defeat. That day marked a victory for the kingdoms across Europe. The legend of Napoleon's invincibility had ended. Leipzig was the battle that started the collapse of Napoleon's imperial dream. Dear listeners, after this battle, Napoleon's power was seriously shaken. Following the defeat at Leipzig, Napoleon was forced to retreat, but this retreat only bought him time. The Allied states in Europe were determined to corner Napoleon. The lands he had once conquered were now slipping away from him one by one. His army was no longer as strong, his allies had turned their backs on him, and his enemies grew closer every day. Finally, in 1814, the combined European armies advanced to the heart of France. And that unforgettable moment arrived, the occupation of Paris. Yes, dear listeners, Paris, the city where Napoleon had celebrated his victories, the symbol of his power, was now under enemy control. When the great coalition entered Paris, Napoleon had entered an irreversible path. The capital of his empire had fallen into enemy hands. This was a great humiliation for Napoleon. Now all of Europe saw that Napoleon's era had ended. The fall of Paris marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon. In 1814, he descended from the peak of his power as emperor and had to abdicate the throne. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had stirred up storms in Europe, overthrown kingdoms, and established empires with armies, was now condemned to exile. And this was only his first exile. Ah, what a great fall. The once great emperor who had made Europe bow before him was now even a burden in the eyes of his own people. Napoleon, who began his journey as a commander with one of history's most glorious victories, would face a tragic end. When Europe's great powers united, even Napoleon's ambition and military genius were not enough to stop this united force. Ah, dear friends, Napoleon's fate was to be an emperor, but it was inevitable that he would face a great downfall. After the fall of Paris, the major powers of Europe decided to end Napoleon's reign and exile him to a place where he could never again pose a threat. So in 1814, after losing his people and his capital, Napoleon signed one of the most dramatic chapters in his history, his exile to the island of Elba. Can you imagine? That great emperor who once brought continents to their knees was now abandoned on a tiny island in the Mediterranean. Elba was a tiny place near the coast of Italy. Napoleon had limited authority on this island, but of course it was far from what his ambitions demanded. Although he established his own small government there, built roads, and started modernization efforts, he could never extinguish the fire of his imperial passion. He was born for victories, and even the waves on the shore reminded him of other lands he needed to conquer. For Napoleon, Elba was not an exile, but a place waiting for an opportunity. But dear friends, Napoleon was no ordinary person. His ambition and willpower never waned. No matter how distant an island the great powers of Europe thought was suitable for him, he was inevitably going to return. And then the great moment arrived. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon showed that he had no intention of staying in exile any longer and secretly escaped from Elba. With a few loyal soldiers, he boarded a small ship and set sail for France. Napoleon's return was like a legendary comeback. He landed on French soil like a hero returning from exile. When Napoleon returned to France, it was clear once again how great a commander and charismatic leader he was. As soon as news of Napoleon's escape reached France, royalists were thrown into a panic. But for the millions of people who had been waiting for his return, it was a beacon of hope. He was not just in exile, he was about to become emperor once more. When Napoleon set foot in France, the first troops he encountered were royalist soldiers. Oh, my friends. Instead of telling them to lay down their weapons, Napoleon made a famous move. He dismounted his horse, bared his chest, and threw himself in front of the soldiers, shouting, "If anyone wants to kill me, here I am. Fire." This dramatic moment deeply affected the soldiers' spirits. Rather than firing on him, the soldiers lowered their weapons and joined Napoleon's ranks. This event quickly spread among the people, showing just how epic Napoleon's return to France was. As he advanced towards Paris, former soldiers, officers, and crowds of people loyal to him began to join him. He advanced like a storm, rekindling the victories of old. And so within just a few weeks, Napoleon entered Paris and took his old throne again. This period is known in history as the 100 Days Les Cent Jours, because Napoleon's time back in power lasted about 100 days. But these 100 days were for him a final quest for victory, an effort to regain his former glory. When he returned to the throne, Napoleon wanted to send this message to all of Europe: I am still here. I am still a great emperor. However, this return echoed not only in France but across all of Europe. Once Europe's major powers learned of Napoleon's return, they immediately sprang into action. The end of Napoleon's reign with the Sixth Coalition's victory had now returned as an even greater threat. Napoleon's reassertion of power represented a significant threat to Europe's monarchies, and this threat was taken very seriously. The coalition forces came together once again to achieve a decisive victory over Napoleon. But Napoleon didn't stop. As Emperor of France once more, he began preparing for war again. He was regrouping France's military strength, bringing together old generals, and developing strategies to march across Europe once more. Unfortunately, no matter how great Napoleon's power and desire for victory were, this time the combined armies of Europe were stronger against him. Despite all his preparations, Napoleon was aware of the impending great conflict. And when that big day arrived, the countdown to one of history's most famous battles, the Battle of Waterloo, had begun. Dear friends, no matter how grand and magnificent Napoleon's return was, the obstacles he faced were now much larger and more challenging. Europe was preparing for war against Napoleon with unity and a more determined spirit. Napoleon's escape from Elba and the brief glory he created in France were sadly just a fleeting glimpse on the path to a greater collapse, and this path would lead him to his ultimate end. Dear friends, let me take you to one of the most tragic yet striking moments in history, the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon's last great fight. Oh, that day! A day where glory and defeat intertwined, sealing the fate of France's greatest emperor. After returning from Elba victorious, Napoleon took the throne in Paris once again. But the rest of Europe was on the move. England, Prussia, Austria, and Russia knew that Napoleon's return would upset the balance of power in Europe. So they united once more. Napoleon was ready to wage war against Europe, but this time he faced a much more organized, determined, and powerful enemy than before. Still, Napoleon's military genius gave him hope for one final victory, and he would fight this last battle on the historic grounds of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo began on the morning of June 18, 1815. Napoleon was once again in pursuit of victory at the head of his army. Opposing him were the British forces under General Wellington and the Prussian army. Wellington's troops were positioned strategically. They were on high ground, which made them more resilient against Napoleon's forces. But Napoleon, as always, was confident. The early morning clashes were fierce. Napoleon maneuvered to split the British forces and ordered a massive infantry assault. His artillery was bombarding the British lines with terrifying intensity. However, the British army put up a strong resistance. Napoleon's experienced soldiers fought bravely, recalling the past victories of the French Empire. Yet this battle was tougher than any before. Napoleon had underestimated one crucial factor: the Prussian forces arriving to support Wellington in a very short time. Prussian commander Blücher was one of the key figures who changed the course of the battle. The Prussian troops advanced rapidly to support Wellington, disrupting Napoleon's plans to destroy the divided British forces. Napoleon initially saw the arrival of the Prussian troops as an opportunity, but he quickly realized that the Prussian army was pushing his forces back. The battlefield atmosphere grew increasingly chaotic. Napoleon knew that France's fate was tied to this battle. He deployed his cavalry, but the British famous square formations managed to hold them off. Every new assault meant further weakening of Napoleon's forces. The great Emperor of France was fighting for his last victory, but as the hours passed, it became clear that he was sliding towards defeat on the battlefield. Eventually, when the Prussian forces reached the British side, all hope seemed lost for Napoleon. The Battle of Waterloo was not just the end for Napoleon, but for France as well. As Wellington watched the enemy's shattered army, he uttered his famous line for the history books: "This was the most bloody day of my life, but it was also the day of my victory." And so, dear friends, at the Battle of Waterloo, France's great Emperor Napoleon suffered the greatest defeat of his life. The weight of the defeat fell not only on Napoleon but on all of France. Witnessing the fall of an emperor is always hard, but the pain of Waterloo shook the entire world. Because everyone knew that this was not just a battle, But the moment of Napoleon's final downfall. Immediately following the defeat, Napoleon retreated to France. But there was very little left for him to do. His army was scattered, his allies had surrendered. Yet surrendering was against his nature. But as the invaders approached Paris, Napoleon didn't want France to suffer further destruction. After that great defeat, he abdicated the throne. This was his second abdication, but this time there was no chance of returning. And so, dear friends, Napoleon surrendered. But this surrender would take him not only from his throne but from the world stage. The Allied powers decided to send Napoleon to a much more remote place this time. He had escaped from Elba, but this time he was to be exiled to a place from which he could not escape, St. Helena. This island, isolated in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and almost unreachable, would become Napoleon's new prison. St. Helena was where Napoleon spent the last years of his life. On this island, filled with memories of past glories, failures, and regrets, only a silent solitude remained of the empire's grandeur. Napoleon, on that distant island, reflecting on his role in history and remembering the days of his great conquests, breathed his last. Ah, my friends, one of history's most tragic endings was thus written. The great commander who once subdued Europe, shook kingdoms, and led armies was now lost in the pages of history, in an island prison. But Napoleon's name will never be forgotten, because his story is the saga of both triumph and defeat. Ah, my dear friends, we've reached the end of a grand story. What a long, tumultuous, and epic life it was, right? Napoleon Bonaparte rose from a forgotten island to become one of the greatest emperors in history. But now his story too has come to an end. Just like every grand tale, Napoleon's life has concluded. Yet he left behind a legacy that will never be forgotten. It's the year 1821. Napoleon was living a lonely life on the remote island of St. Helena, far from the world's gaze. Oh, my friends, this great man, who once held the fate of Europe in his hands, was now lost among the wheels of destiny. Let's imagine his final days together. St. Helena was a nearly forgotten corner of the world in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Here Napoleon was far from the vast lands he once conquered and the great battles he won, left only with the memories of his past triumphs. Those who sent him to this small island were determined that Napoleon would never return to Europe and reclaim power. Because if Napoleon were to rise again, who knows, he might have gone on to conquer Europe anew and pursue his imperial dreams from where he left off. On this island, Napoleon had weakened both physically and mentally. The man who once shook the battlefields with his boundless energy was now in poor health, struggling with illness. But my friends, Napoleon's spirit was still strong. He still felt like an emperor. While sitting alone in his room, he reflected on the great battles he had fought, his belief in the revolution, and his imperial dreams. Perhaps in the dark nights of St. Helena, the echoes of victory from those distant lands still resonated in his ears. And that final day, May 5th, 1821. It was a rainy, gloomy day. The dark sky over St. Helena bore witness to Napoleon's last breath. Napoleon was on the brink of death. But friends, even death couldn't overshadow Napoleon's greatness. Before he passed, Napoleon closed his eyes one last time and perhaps replayed his life filled with victories like a film reel in his mind. He recalled the brilliant victories that had won him Europe, with the imperial crown on his head. The man who once shaped Europe's destiny with his armies was now at the end of his life. Napoleon's final words are perhaps the best reflection of his character. France, the army, the commander, Josephine. These words tell us about the things Napoleon valued most in his life. France, his one and only homeland, the country he fought for. The army, the soldiers who drove him from victory to victory. The commander, Napoleon himself, always the man who fought for victory. And Josephine, his one true love, the greatest witness to his faith. As Napoleon took his last breath, he left behind a significant legacy. Historians have debated his successes, victories, and mistakes for years. Some called him a hero, others a tyrant. But the truth is, Napoleon will continue to be remembered as one of history's greatest figures. Ah, my dear friends, even after Napoleon's death, his legacy continued to live on. The roads he paved, the reforms he made, and the systems he established resonated not just in France but across Europe. He was not just a soldier or a commander. He was also a statesman, a reformer, a leader. The legal system Napoleon brought, the Napoleonic Code, still inspires many countries' legal systems today. These laws show how visionary Napoleon was, not just on the battlefield but also in establishing justice and order. This man, who transformed the ideals of the French Revolution into an imperial dream, faced many defeats and setbacks, but always managed to rise again. That's why Napoleon's story shows us the strength of human will. We might face defeat, friends, but great leaders like Napoleon know how to rise and fight again, even in the darkest moments. So, dear friends, Napoleon Bonaparte's life story ends here. But this story is not just about one man, it's also about an era, a period filled with revolutions, wars, and victories. Napoleon became a figure who transcended his time and entered history. And as we recount his legacy today, we embark on a journey into the depths of history. Even after the death of this great man, his name has not been forgotten. Today in Paris, Napoleon's tomb at Les Invalides is still visited by thousands of people who come to pay their respects. His legacy will live on forever, not just through the victories he won on the battlefield, but also through his impact on history. And so, dear friends, Napoleon's story comes to an end. But his story remains a lesson for us. Great victories, great defeats, grand dreams, and great disappointments. All these are elements that shape a leader's life. Napoleon taught us that even the greatest empire eventually ends, but the legacy left behind lives on forever. Yes, friends, the saga of Napoleon Bonaparte ends here. But as we close this page of history, I feel that something remains in all our hearts. Victory, ambition, love, defeat, and power. These are the elements that shaped Napoleon's life and perhaps offer lessons for our own lives as well. As we bid farewell from the depths of history to the present, and from the present to the future, remember that history always teaches us something. Understanding the past is the key to shaping the future.